Picture this. A woman strides confidently into a luxury hotel, her designer heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Her tailored suit and elegant jewelry hint at wealth and success. But as she approaches the front desk, something unexpected happens. The receptionist's welcoming smile fades, replaced by a look of disdain. What unfolds next will leave you shocked, angry, and ultimately inspired. This is the story of Amara Jackson, a self-made tech mogul whose net worth recently crossed the billion-dollar mark. But on this fateful day, her bank account meant nothing. The color of her skin, it seemed, was all that mattered to the staff of the prestigious Goldcrest Hotel. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the receptionist said, not sounding sorry at all. "We're fully booked." Amara frowned, pulling out her phone. "That's strange. Your website shows several suites available." The receptionist's smile tightened. "Perhaps there's been a glitch. I assure you, we have no vacancies." As Amara stood there, processing what was happening, she noticed other guests being checked in without issue. All of them, she couldn't help but notice, were white. "Is there a problem here?" A man in an expensive suit approached, his name tag identifying him as the hotel manager. Amara explained the situation, her voice calm but firm. The manager's response was a masterclass in condescension. "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable at a different establishment," he said, his tone making it clear this was no suggestion. "Perhaps I could recommend somewhere more suitable." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Amara felt a familiar mix of emotions: anger, hurt, and a bone-deep weariness. She'd faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, never in a place that prided itself on catering to the elite. For a moment, she was tempted to pull out her platinum card, to name-drop the tech giants and venture capital firms that begged for her attention. But why should she have to prove her worth? Why should her money matter more than her humanity? Instead, Amara straightened her spine and met the manager's gaze. "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for making your position clear." Without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a lobby full of curious onlookers. As she climbed into her waiting car, Amara's mind was already racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "James, it's Amara. Remember that real estate deal we were discussing? I think I've found the perfect opportunity." 2 weeks later, the staff of the Goldcrest Hotel was summoned to an emergency meeting. Rumors had been swirling about a change in ownership, but nothing could have prepared them for what came next. The same manager who had dismissed Amara now stood at the front of the room, his face ashen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I'd like to introduce you to the hotel's new owner." A hush fell over the room as Amara walked in, her head held high. The look of shock on the receptionist's face was almost comical. Amara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before addressing the stunned staff. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Amara Jackson, and as of today, I own not just this hotel, but the entire Goldcrest chain." The silence was deafening. Amara continued, her voice clear and strong. "I want to be very clear about something. What happened to me here 2 weeks ago? That ends now. This hotel, and every property in our portfolio, will be a place of true luxury. And true luxury isn't just about thread counts and champagne. It's about treating every guest and every employee with dignity and respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I saw an opportunity, not just to buy a hotel, but to change its culture, to show that excellence and inclusivity aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they go hand in hand." As Amara outlined her vision for the future, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Shock gave way to curiosity, and in some faces, a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just a change in ownership. It was the dawn of a new era. But Amara was under no illusions. She knew that changing hearts and minds wouldn't happen overnight. There would be resistance, resentment, and probably more than a few resignations. The road ahead would be challenging, to say the least. As she wrapped up her speech, Amara's gaze fell on the manager and receptionist who had dismissed her so callously. Their futures at the hotel hung in the balance. Would she fire them, giving them a taste of the rejection they had so freely dished out? Or would she take the high road, offering them a chance at redemption? Amara's decision would set the tone for everything that followed. It would define her leadership style and shape the hotel's new identity. As she opened her mouth to address them directly, the entire room held its breath. In that moment, Amara held more than the fate of 2 employees in her hands. She held the power to turn an ugly incident into a catalyst for real, meaningful change. The question was, how would she use it? As the story of the Gold Crest Hotel's transformation began to spread, it sparked conversations far beyond its gilded doors. In boardrooms and living rooms, on social media and news broadcasts, people debated the larger implications. Was this a feel-good anomaly, or could it represent a shift in how corporations approach diversity and inclusion? For Amara, this was more than a business venture. It was a chance to challenge perceptions, to prove that success and integrity could go hand in hand. But as she settled into her new role, she knew the real work was just beginning. How would she balance accountability with compassion? Could she create lasting change, or would old habits prove too ingrained to break? And as her story gained attention, how would she handle the inevitable backlash from those resistant to change? As the sun set on Amara's first day as hotel owner, she stood at the window of the presidential suite, the very room she had been denied weeks earlier. The city lights twinkled below, full of promise and possibility. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectations on her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to lead by example. But for tonight, Amara allowed herself a moment to savor her victory, not just over discrimination, but over the doubt and fear that so often hold people back from taking a stand. This was more than a story about a hotel. It was a testament to resilience, a challenge to the status quo, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is success. As Amara turned away from the window, her mind was already racing with plans for the future. The story of Amara Jackson and the Gold Crest Hotel was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And if the events of the past few weeks were any indication, it promised to be a tale that would inspire, challenge, and maybe, just maybe, change the world a little bit for the better. As the days turned into weeks, the Gold Crest Hotel became a hotbed of change and controversy. Amara's decision regarding the manager and receptionist had sent ripples through the entire organization. She hadn't fired them outright, as many had expected. Instead, she'd given them a choice: participate in an intensive diversity and inclusion training program, or resign. "I'm not interested in punishment," Amara had told them, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm interested in growth. If you're willing to learn and change, there's a place for you here. If not, well, there's the door." The manager, a man named Richard, had swallowed his pride and agreed to the training. The receptionist, Sarah, had quit on the spot, her face flushed with a mix of shame and defiance. As she stormed out, Amara couldn't help but wonder if she'd made the right call. Was she being too lenient, or was this the first step towards genuine change? Meanwhile, news of Amara's takeover had spread like wildfire. Social media was abuzz with hashtags like #GoldCrestRevolution and #AmaraEffect. Many praised her bold move, hailing it as a victory against discrimination. Others, predictably, pushed back. Anonymous online trolls accused her of reverse racism and playing the victim card. Amara tried to ignore the noise, focusing instead on the monumental task before her. She threw herself into revamping the hotel's policies, from hiring practices to customer service protocols. Every decision was scrutinized, every change met with a mix of enthusiasm and resistance. One particularly tense meeting stood out in Amara's mind. She gathered the heads of each department to discuss new diversity quotas for hiring and promotion. The room was thick with unspoken tension as she laid out her plans. "This isn't about tokenism," Amara explained, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about creating opportunities for talented individuals who have been overlooked for far too long." A middle-aged white man, Tom, the head of maintenance, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Ms. Jackson," he began, his tone anything but respectful, "shouldn't we be focusing on qualifications rather than other factors?" The room fell silent, all eyes darting between Tom and Amara. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was exactly the kind of mindset she was here to change. "Tom," she said calmly, "I understand your concern. But let me ask you this. In your years here, how many people of color have you seen in management positions? How many women? How many disabled individuals?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Amara pressed on. "The talent is out there. Our job is to find it, nurture it, and give it a chance to shine. And that starts with acknowledging that our current system isn't as merit-based as we'd like to think." As the meeting continued, Amara could see the wheels turning in some minds, while others remained stubbornly set in their ways. She knew she couldn't win everyone over overnight, but every small victory felt significant. Outside the hotel, Amara's story was gaining traction in unexpected ways. A group of Black entrepreneurs had started a fund to help minorities in the hospitality industry. They named it the Amara Jackson Initiative, much to her surprise and humility. Invitations for speaking engagements flooded in. Everyone wanted to hear from the woman who had turned the tables on discrimination in such a dramatic fashion. Amara accepted a few, carefully choosing platforms where she felt her message would have the most impact. At one such event, a young woman approached Amara after her speech, tears in her eyes. "You've given me hope," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been passed over for promotions so many times, always with some vague excuse. Hearing your story, it makes me believe that things can change." Moments like these fueled Amara, giving her strength on the days when the challenges seemed insurmountable. And there were plenty of those days. Despite her best efforts, incidents of discrimination still occurred at the hotel. A same-sex couple was treated rudely by an old guard employee. A Muslim guest found his prayer rug disturbed after room service. Each incident was a painful reminder of how deep-rooted these issues were. Amara dealt with each situation head-on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting an uphill battle. For every step forward, it seemed they took 2 steps back. One night, as she sat alone in her office long after most employees had gone home, Amara found herself questioning everything. Was she really making a difference, or was this all just an exercise in futility? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Richard, the manager she'd almost fired on day 1. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his tie as he asked if he could speak with her. "Ms. Jackson," he began, his voice hesitant. I owe you an apology. A real one, not just the corporate line I've been towing." Amara leaned back in her chair, her expression carefully neutral. "Go on," she said. Richard took a deep breath. "When you first came in that day, I saw you as a problem to be dealt with, not a person deserving of respect. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. And these past weeks, seeing how you've handled everything, it's opened my eyes." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I want to do better. To be better. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but if you're willing to give it, I promise I'll make the most of it." Amara studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against his actions over the past weeks. She'd seen glimpses of change in him, but was it enough? Could people truly transform their deepest held beliefs? As she opened her mouth to respond, another knock came at the door. It was Sarah, the receptionist who had quit rather than undergo the diversity training. Her presence sent a jolt of tension through the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, her voice small. I was hoping I could talk to you, Ms. Jackson, about my behavior and maybe about coming back." Amara found herself at a crossroads. The decisions she made now would not only affect Richard and Sarah, but would set a precedent for the entire organization. How she handled this situation could determine the success or failure of everything she'd been working towards. As she looked between the two people who had once dismissed her so callously, Amara felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. The eyes of the world were on the Goldcrest Hotel, watching to see if real change was possible. What would she do? Embrace forgiveness and second chances, potentially at the risk of being seen as weak, or stand firm in her initial decisions, possibly losing an opportunity for genuine transformation. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second feeling like an eternity. Amara's mind raced, considering all the potential outcomes. Whatever she decided would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the hotel, but for the broader conversation about discrimination and corporate responsibility. As she prepared to speak, Amara knew that her next words could change everything. The question was, in which direction? Amara took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between Richard and Sarah. The tension in the room was palpable. "Let's sit down," she said finally, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. As they settled in, Amara's mind raced, weighing the potential outcomes of this unexpected meeting. "I appreciate you both coming to me," she began, her voice measured. "But I need to understand. What's changed? Why now?" Richard spoke first, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "The training program. It opened my eyes. I've always prided myself on being fair, but I realize now that I had blind spots. Huge ones." He paused, swallowing hard. "Seeing the hotel through new eyes, hearing stories from staff members I've worked with for years, it's been humbling. And honestly, pretty uncomfortable." Sarah nodded, her eyes downcast. "I was angry when I left," she admitted. "I felt like I was being punished for something I didn't think was wrong. But these past weeks, watching the changes here, seeing the conversations happening, I realized I was on the wrong side of history." She looked up, meeting Amara's gaze. "I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Amara listened intently, her expression neutral. Part of her wanted to believe in their sincerity, to embrace this as a victory for her vision of change. But another part remained skeptical. Were they truly transformed, or just saying what they thought she wanted to hear? Before she could respond, a commotion outside caught their attention. Raised voices echoed from the lobby, growing louder by the second. Amara stood, moving swiftly to investigate, Richard and Sarah following close behind. The scene that greeted them was chaotic. A group of protesters had somehow made it past security and were now in the lobby, waving signs and chanting, "No reverse racism. Merit, not quotas." Their angry voices bounced off the marble walls, creating a cacophony of discontent. Amara's security team was trying to contain the situation, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. As she assessed the scene, Amara caught sight of a familiar face among the protesters. Tom, the maintenance head who had challenged her in the meeting about diversity quotas. For a moment, Amara felt a wave of despair. Was this the fruit of all her efforts? Had she only succeeded in stirring up more anger and resentment? But as she watched, something unexpected happened. Several hotel employees, of various races and backgrounds, stepped forward. They formed a human chain between the protesters and the frightened guests, their faces determined. "This is not what we stand for," one of them called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. "The Goldcrest is a place of respect for all." Amara felt a surge of pride and hope. These employees, standing up for the values she'd been championing, weren't doing it for her benefit. They were doing it because they believed in it. As the security team finally managed to escort the protesters out, Amara turned to Richard and Sarah, who had witnessed everything. "This," she said, gesturing to the employees who had stood up to the protesters, "this is what we're working towards. It's not about me or any one person. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued and empowered to stand up for what's right." The incident in the lobby became a turning point, but not in the way Amara had expected. News of the protests spread quickly, and soon the Goldcrest found itself at the center of a national conversation about workplace diversity and corporate responsibility. Interviews requests poured in. Think pieces were written. Hashtags trended. Some praised the Goldcrest as a model of progressive business practices. Others condemned it as an example of woke capitalism gone too far. Amara did her best to stay focused on the work at hand, but the increased scrutiny was taking its toll. Every decision, every new policy was dissected and debated in the court of public opinion. The pressure was immense. Meanwhile, within the hotel, the changes were starting to bear fruit. A young black woman was promoted to head of customer relations, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the role. The housekeeping staff, predominantly immigrants, reported feeling more respected and valued. But challenges remained. Some longtime employees, feeling threatened by the changes, became passive-aggressive or openly hostile. Guests occasionally complained about the new, more diverse staff, using coded language to mask their prejudice. Amara found herself constantly walking a tightrope, trying to push for meaningful change without alienating those resistant to it. It was exhausting, often thankless work. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest guest satisfaction scores, Amara received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Chen, an elderly housekeeper who had been with the hotel for over 2 decades. "Ms. Jackson," Mrs. Chen said, her accent thick but her eyes bright, "I bring you something." She placed a small, intricately folded paper crane on Amara's desk. "In my culture, this means hope and healing. You bring this to our hotel." Touched, Amara picked up the delicate creation. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That means a lot to me." Mrs. Chen nodded solemnly. "Not easy, what you do, but important. My granddaughter, she want to be manager someday. Before, I tell her, not possible. Now," she smiled. "Now I tell her, work hard, is possible." As Mrs. Chen left, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. These small victories, these individual lives changed. This was why she had taken on this monumental task. But even as she allowed herself a moment of optimism, a new challenge was brewing. Unknown to Amara, a group of influential investors was quietly organizing, concerned about the potential impact of her reforms on the hotel's bottom line. They were preparing to challenge her leadership, possibly even push for her removal. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across Amara's office, the stage was set for a showdown that would determine not just the future of the Goldcrest Hotel, but perhaps the future of corporate diversity efforts across the country. Amara stood at her window, the paper crane in her hand, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. The real test of her vision, her leadership, and her resolve was yet to come. And the whole world would be watching. The following weeks at the Goldcrest Hotel were a whirlwind of activity. Amara, buoyed by Mrs. Chen's gesture and the small victories she was seeing, threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. She implemented a mentorship program, pairing senior staff with promising junior employees from diverse backgrounds. The initiative was starting to show results, with fresh ideas percolating up through the ranks and a new sense of camaraderie developing across departments. But beneath the surface of progress, trouble was brewing. Amara began to notice a shift in the atmosphere during board meetings. Pointed questions about profit margins and shareholder value became more frequent. She could feel the undercurrent of dissatisfaction, but couldn't quite put her finger on its source. One rainy Tuesday morning, Amara's assistant rushed into her office, looking flustered. "Ms. Jackson, you need to see this," she said, handing over a tablet. On the screen was a financial news site, its headlines screaming in bold letters. "Diversity at what cost? Goldcrest Hotel Group stocks plummet amid controversy." Amara's heart sank as she scrolled through the article. Anonymous sources within the company had leaked information suggesting that her diversity initiatives were costing the hotel millions. The story painted her as a reckless idealist, more concerned with social justice than sound business practices. As she tried to process this betrayal, her phone began to ring incessantly. Investors demanded explanations. The media clamored for statements. Even some of her allies on the board were asking tough questions. In the midst of this storm, Amara received an unexpected call from Richard, the manager she had given a second chance. "Ms. Jackson," he said, his voice tense, "there's something you need to know. I've overheard some of the board members talking. They're planning to call an emergency meeting to vote on your removal." Amara felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She thanked Richard for the information, her mind already racing to formulate a plan. She had 5 days until the board meeting. 5 days to save not just her job, but the vision of inclusivity she'd been fighting for. Those 5 days became a blur of activity. Amara worked around the clock, gathering data, preparing presentations, and rallying her supporters. She reached out to every employee who had benefited from her initiatives, asking them to share their stories. The response was overwhelming, with heartfelt testimonials pouring in from all levels of the organization. But would it be enough? The investors cared about numbers, not narratives. Amara needed to prove that diversity wasn't just the right thing to do. It was good for business. She enlisted the help of Sarah, the former receptionist who had returned to the hotel with a newfound commitment to change. Together, they pored over financial reports, customer feedback, and industry trends. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, one that told a very different story than the leaked report. As the day of the board meeting dawned, Amara stood in her office, steeling herself for the battle ahead. She could see the media vans already gathering outside, hungry for a story of corporate drama. The weight of expectation, from her supporters, her critics, and everyone in between, pressed down on her shoulders. Just then, there was a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Chen, along with a group of employees representing every department of the hotel. "We stand with you, Ms. Jackson," Mrs. Chen said simply, handing Amara a box filled with paper cranes, one from every employee who believed in her vision. Touched beyond words, Amara thanked them, drawing strength from their support. As she walked towards the boardroom, the box of paper cranes tucked under her arm, she knew that this meeting would determine far more than just her fate. It would set a precedent for whether true, meaningful change was possible in the corporate world. The boardroom was tense as Amara entered, the faces around the table a mix of hostility, concern, and guarded curiosity. At the head of the table sat Gerald Winters, the lead investor and the man rumored to be spearheading the effort to remove her. His cold eyes followed Amara as she took her seat, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Ms. Jackson," Gerald began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "I believe you know why we're here. Your experiments in social engineering have been quite costly. We're here to determine if the Goldcrest can afford to continue down this path." Concern and guarded curiosity. At the head of the table sat Gerald Winters, the lead investor and the man rumored to be spearheading the effort to remove her. His cold eyes followed Amara as she took her seat, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Ms. Jackson," Gerald began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "I believe you know why we're here. Your experiments in social engineering have been quite costly. We're here to determine if the Goldcrest can afford to continue down this path." Amara met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "Before we begin," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I'd like to present some information that I believe will change the way you see this situation." As she began her presentation, Amara could feel the energy in the room shift. She laid out the data Sarah had helped her compile, showing how employee satisfaction had skyrocketed, leading to lower turnover and training costs. She presented glowing customer reviews, many specifically mentioning the diverse and attentive staff. And finally, she revealed projections showing that while initial costs had been high, the long-term savings and improved reputation were set to boost profits significantly in the coming years. The board members leaned in, their expressions changing from skepticism to interest. Even Gerald's smirk had faded, replaced by a look of grudging respect. But Amara wasn't done. She pulled out her secret weapon, the box of paper cranes. One by one, she read out the stories attached to each crane. Stories of employees whose lives had been changed, whose careers had been launched, whose faith in the possibility of a fair and inclusive workplace had been restored. As she finished, a hush fell over the room. Amara looked around at the board members, her heart pounding. She had given it everything she had. Now it was time for them to decide. Gerald cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Well, Ms. Jackson, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. I move that we put this to a vote." Amara held her breath as Gerald continued. "All those in favor of removing Amara Jackson from her position as CEO, raise your hand." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone looked around, waiting to see who would make the first move. Amara's future, and the future of everything she had worked for, hung in the balance. As the board members glanced nervously at one another, the door to the boardroom suddenly burst open. A young woman rushed in, out of breath, and clutching a stack of papers. It was Jessica, one of the hotel's newest hires in the marketing department. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she gasped, "but you all need to see this right away." Gerald's face twisted in annoyance. "Young lady, this is a private meeting. You can't just—" "It's okay," Amara interrupted, recognizing the urgency in Jessica's eyes. "Let her speak." Jessica straightened up, her voice steadying as she addressed the room. "I've been monitoring our social media channels, and in the last hour, something big has happened. Our guests, past and present, they're speaking up." She began passing out the papers she'd brought, each one a printout of social media posts and online reviews. As the board members read, their expressions changed from irritation to surprise. "A stand with Goldcrest is trending," Jessica explained. "People are sharing stories about their experiences at our hotel since the changes Ms. Jackson implemented. They're talking about feeling truly welcomed, about the exceptional service from our diverse staff. And it's not just individuals. Corporate clients are chiming in too, saying they choose us because of our inclusive policies." Amara's heart raced as she scanned the printouts. There were tweets from celebrities praising the hotel's stance on diversity, posts from business leaders announcing they'd be booking their next conference at the Goldcrest, even a statement from a prominent civil rights organization commending the hotel's initiatives. The room buzzed with murmurs as the board members digested this new information. Gerald's face had turned an interesting shade of red, his carefully laid plans crumbling before his eyes. But just as the tide seemed to be turning in Amara's favor, another twist awaited. The hotel's CFO, a quiet man named Robert who had remained silent throughout the meeting, slowly stood up. "While this public support is impressive," he began, his voice hesitant, "there's something else you all need to know." He pulled out a folder and started distributing documents. "These are financial projections I've been working on. They show that while Ms. Jackson's initiatives have indeed improved our reputation, they've also made us a target." A confused murmur rippled through the room. Robert continued, "Several of our competitors have launched aggressive marketing campaigns specifically targeting our corporate clients. They're undercutting our prices significantly, arguing that companies can get the same quality service without paying a premium for our social experiments." Amara felt her stomach drop. She had been so focused on proving the value of her vision, she hadn't considered how their competitors might retaliate. "If these projections are accurate," Robert went on, "we stand to lose a significant portion of our corporate bookings over the next quarter. This could offset any gains we've made and potentially put us in the red." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Amara's mind raced, trying to find a solution. She had come so close, only to have this new threat emerge at the 11th hour. Gerald seized the moment, his confidence returning. "Well, it seems the picture isn't as rosy as Ms. Jackson would have us believe. Perhaps it's time we reconsider." But before he could finish, another interruption came. This time, it was Richard, the manager Amara had given a second chance to. He entered the room, followed by a group of people Amara didn't recognize. "I apologize for the intrusion," Richard said, his voice firm. But these individuals insisted on speaking to the board immediately. They're representatives from some of our largest corporate clients. A woman in a sharp business suit stepped forward. "We've been hearing rumors about potential changes in Goldcrest's leadership and policies. We're here to make our position clear. If the hotel abandons its commitment to diversity and inclusion, our companies will take our business elsewhere." One by one, the other representatives echoed this sentiment. They spoke of the importance of partnering with organizations that shared their values, of the positive feedback they'd received from employees who had stayed at the Goldcrest. As Amara listened, a mix of emotions washed over her. Gratitude for this unexpected support, anxiety about the financial challenges Robert had revealed, and a steely determination to find a way forward. The boardroom had become a battleground of competing interests and conflicting data. The decision no longer seemed as clear-cut as Gerald had hoped. Board members whispered urgently to one another, trying to make sense of the rapidly changing situation. Amara stood up, all eyes turning to her. This was her moment, perhaps her last chance to save everything she had worked for. But as she opened her mouth to speak, yet another person entered the room. It was Sarah, the former receptionist, now one of Amara's strongest allies. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she approached Amara. "Ms. Jackson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you earlier." She glanced nervously at Gerald before continuing. "It's about the leaked financial report that started all this. I know who's behind it." The room fell deadly silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for Sarah's next words. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. Whatever Sarah was about to reveal, she knew it would change everything. The fate of the Goldcrest Hotel, her vision for an inclusive workplace, and her own career hung in the balance. As Sarah took a deep breath to continue, Amara braced herself for one final, game-changing revelation. Sarah's voice trembled as she continued. The leaked report, it wasn't just leaked. It was fabricated. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. I overheard a conversation. The numbers were manipulated to make Ms. Jackson's initiatives look like they were failing. All eyes turned to Gerald, whose face had drained of color. "That's preposterous," he sputtered, but his usual confidence was gone. Amara, stunned by this revelation, found her voice. "Who, Sarah? Who did this?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes darting nervously around the room. It was a coordinated effort. Gerald was involved, but he wasn't alone. She turned to face Robert, the CFO who had just presented the dire financial projections. "You were part of it too, weren't you?" Robert's face crumpled, the weight of guilt visible in his expression. I didn't want to," he stammered. "But Gerald threatened my job, my pension. I have a family to think about." The room erupted into chaos. Board members shouted accusations and demands for explanations. The corporate representatives watched in shocked silence. Amara felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the tumult. It was Tom, the maintenance head who had once challenged Amara's diversity quotas and later joined the protesters. "Enough," he bellowed, silencing the room. "I've seen enough of this nonsense." Tom turned to face Amara, his expression a mix of shame and determination. "Ms. Jackson, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, wrong about all of this. I let my fear of change blind me to the good you were doing." He paused, then continued with resolve. "But I'm not going to stand by and watch this hotel destroy itself over lies and greed." To everyone's surprise, Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "I've been gathering evidence," he explained. "Conversations, emails, doctored reports. It's all here. I was planning to use it against you, Ms. Jackson, but now I realize it proves your innocence and exposes this whole scheme." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Gerald and Robert seemed to shrink in their seats, the full weight of their actions crashing down on them. Amara, still processing this turn of events, stepped forward. Her voice was steady as she addressed the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a choice to make. We can let fear, greed, and resistance to change dictate our future, or we can embrace a new way of doing business, one that values diversity, promotes inclusion, and yes, drives profit." She gestured to the corporate representatives still standing at the back of the room. "Our clients are telling us what they want. Our employees have shown us what they're capable of when given the chance. And our guests," she picked up one of the social media printouts, "they're shouting it from the rooftops." Amara's voice grew stronger, filled with passion and conviction. "The Goldcrest has an opportunity to be more than just another luxury hotel. We can be leaders in our industry, showing that ethical business practices and financial success aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they go hand in hand." She turned to face Gerald and Robert directly. "As for the deception that's been uncovered here today, I leave it to the board to decide how to proceed. But know this, I will not allow the hard work and dedication of our staff to be undermined by the actions of a few." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Board members stood, voicing their support for Amara and her vision. The corporate representatives smiled, nodding their approval. As the cheers died down, the board chairman cleared his throat. "I think it's clear where we stand. The vote to remove Ms. Jackson is hereby nullified. Furthermore, I move that we launch a full investigation into the actions of Mr. Winters and Mr. Thompson, with appropriate consequences to follow." The motion was quickly seconded and passed unanimously. Gerald and Robert were escorted from the room, their futures at the Goldcrest looking decidedly bleak. As the meeting adjourned, people crowded around Amara, offering congratulations and support. But amid the celebration, Amara felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Mrs. Chen, the elderly housekeeper who had given her the first paper crane. "Ms. Jackson," Mrs. Chen said softly, a knowing smile on her face. "There's something you should know." She leaned in close, whispering in Amara's ear. As Mrs. Chen spoke, Amara's eyes widened in surprise. The revelation Mrs. Chen shared wasn't just another twist in the tale of corporate intrigue. It was something far more personal, a piece of information that would reshape Amara's understanding of her own journey. As she processed this final surprise, Amara realized that her story, and the story of the Goldcrest Hotel, was far from over. In fact, a new chapter was just beginning. As the boardroom slowly emptied, Amara stood rooted to the spot, Mrs. Chen's words echoing in her mind. The elderly housekeeper had just revealed that she was the anonymous donor who had provided the initial funding for Amara's tech startup years ago, the very success that had eventually led her to the Goldcrest. "But why?" Amara whispered, her mind reeling. Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled. "Many years ago, when I first came to this country, I was turned away from this very hotel. They said someone like me couldn't afford to stay here." She patted Amara's hand gently. "When I saw what you were trying to do, I knew I had to help. Sometimes, the world needs a little push to change." Overwhelmed with emotion, Amara hugged Mrs. Chen tightly. This unexpected connection brought her journey full circle, reminding her of the countless unseen forces that shape our lives and the power of paying it forward. As news of the day's events spread, the Goldcrest Hotel became a symbol of positive change in the corporate world. Amara's inbox flooded with messages from other companies seeking advice on implementing their own diversity initiatives. The hotel's booking rates soared, with many guests citing the inclusive atmosphere as a key factor in their choice. In the weeks that followed, Amara worked tirelessly to build on momentum. She launched a mentorship program, partnering with local schools and colleges to provide internships and career opportunities for students from underrepresented backgrounds. The program, named Chen's Changemakers in honor of Mrs. Chen, quickly gained national attention. Richard, the manager who had once dismissed Amara, became one of her strongest allies. He spearheaded a series of workshops on unconscious bias, helping staff at all levels recognize and overcome their prejudices. His personal journey of growth and change inspired many others to confront their own biases. Sarah, whose bravery had helped expose the conspiracy, was promoted to head of human resources. She implemented new hiring practices that focused on diverse talent pools and blind resume reviews, ensuring that candidates were evaluated solely on their merits. Even Tom, the former skeptic turned whistleblower, found a new purpose. He worked with the maintenance team to make the hotel more accessible, going above and beyond ADA requirements. His efforts not only improved the experience for guests with disabilities, but also opened up new job opportunities for disabled workers. As the Goldcrest's success story spread, it sparked a wider conversation in the hospitality industry. Other hotels began to follow suit, realizing that diversity and inclusion weren't just ethical imperatives, but also smart business strategies. Industry conferences invited Amara to speak, and she used these platforms to challenge old norms and inspire new thinking. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Despite the overall positive changes, there were still instances of discrimination and resistance. Amara knew that changing deeply ingrained attitudes would take time and persistent effort. She made it a point to address each incident transparently, using them as opportunities for learning and growth rather than sweeping them under the rug. One evening, as Amara was leaving work, she overheard a conversation between two guests in the lobby. An elderly white couple was chatting with a young black family, exchanging stories about their stays. "You know," the older man said, "I'll admit I was a bit unsure when I first heard about all the changes here. But seeing it in action, experiencing the warmth and professionalism of the staff, it's opened my eyes. This is how things should be everywhere." The young mother nodded, smiling. "It's more than just good service. It's about feeling truly welcome, you know. Like we belong here just as much as anyone else." Listening to their conversation, Amara felt a wave of pride and hope. This was what she had been fighting for, not just diversity in numbers, but a genuine culture of inclusion and mutual respect. As the months passed, the Goldcrest's financial results proved that ethical business practices could indeed drive profit. The hotel's revenue had increased by 30%, with customer satisfaction scores at an all-time high. Employee turnover rates plummeted, saving significantly on hiring and training costs. Amara used this success to push for even bolder initiatives. She established a fund to help minority-owned businesses in the local community, recognizing that true change had to extend beyond the hotel's walls. The Goldcrest began sourcing supplies from these businesses, creating a ripple effect of economic empowerment. On the first anniversary of the tumultuous board meeting that had nearly ended her career, Amara organized a special celebration. The hotel lobby was transformed into a vibrant space, showcasing the diversity of its staff and guests. Food stations offered cuisines from around the world, while cultural performances filled the air with music and dance. As Amara stood on a small stage to address the gathered crowd, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She saw Mrs. Chen in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Richard and Sarah stood side by side, their journey from adversaries to allies a testament to the power of open minds and second chances. Tom was there too, chatting animatedly with a group of young interns from the Chen's Changemakers program. "A year ago," Amara began, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "the Goldcrest stood at a crossroads. We could have chosen the easy path, clinging to old ways and familiar prejudices. Instead, we chose to embrace change, to see diversity not as a challenge to be managed, but as a strength to be celebrated." She paused, looking out at the faces before her, a beautiful tapestry of different colors, ages, and backgrounds. "What we've achieved here is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done, in this industry and in our society. But standing here today, seeing all of you, I'm filled with hope. Because I know that when we come together, when we truly see and value each other, there's nothing we can't accomplish." As applause filled the lobby, Amara's gaze fell on a small origami crane perched on the podium. a gift from Mrs. Chen. It reminded her of how far they'd come, and of the countless small acts of courage and kindness that had made this transformation possible. The story of the Gold Crest Hotel and Amara Jackson's fight for inclusion had captured the public's imagination. It wasn't just about one woman's triumph over adversity or one company's ethical stand. It had become a beacon of hope, a real-world example of how diversity, when truly embraced, could lead to remarkable success. As the celebration continued around her, Amara knew that their journey was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new barriers to break down. But looking at the vibrant, diverse community that had formed around the Gold Crest, she felt ready for whatever came next. The Gold Crest Hotel, once a symbol of exclusivity, had become a model of inclusion. And in doing so, it had not only transformed itself, but had also started a movement that was changing the face of corporate America, one story at a time. As the evening wound down, Amara found herself back in her office, gazing out at the city lights. The paper crane Mrs. Chen had given her on that fateful day sat on her desk, a constant reminder of where this journey had begun. She picked it up, running her fingers over its delicate folds, and smiled. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities, and she couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring.